socialismo, patria muerte, venceremos.
You're listening to Sons of Fidel on ANTICONQUISTA with Victor Coronado and Danny Shaw. Sons of Fidel is a platform for the voiceless and marginalized, oppressed and colonized peoples, the working class, Black and brown radicals, the LGBTQ community, and our allies in the struggle against imperialism. Please note, the views expressed by the hosts or guests of Sons of Fidel may not necessarily reflect the views of ANTICONQUISTA.
Good evening, everybody. We're going to start off with a video from Lasair Dhearg's work in Ireland, celebration of International Women's Day.
Today, on International Women's Day, we remember all the women who came before us, who bravely fought for the equality of our gender, our nation, and our class. It was IRA volunteer Maria Farrell who said that we can only end our oppression as women if we end the oppression of our nation. The social position man is not just something to be recited, but is a reminder that none of us are free until all of us are free. Women have always been instrumental in the anti-colonial, anti-capitalist struggle, whether that is here in Ireland or elsewhere in the world. Many of the women involved in our struggle bravely gave their lives in the pursuit of freedom, including Maria Farrell, Moira Drum, Winifred Carney, and Miriam Bailey, amongst many, many others. We remember their sacrifice by dedicating ourselves to the eradication of inequality in all its many forms.
As James Connolly wrote, the worker is a slave of capitalist society. The female worker is a slave of that slave. As we strive for freedom from capitalism, we must also strive for freedom from patriarchy and the attitudes which still exist within our communities today. As we struggle to bring an end to the political, social and economic systems which subjugate our class and our nation, so too must we struggle to end a violent ideology which seeks to stumble women on the basis of our gender. We must fight for a real, lasting social justice and equality for all within a socialist republic. A republic that will foist upon its flag the rights of those who hold up half the sky.
Good evening, peace, peace. Welcome to Los Hijos de Fidel, Sons of Fidel, Daughters of Fidel. We're very excited to be joined by three comrades from Belfast and Kayla. Buenas, Kayla. How you feeling tonight, Kayla?
I'm good. I just found out that today is Forgiveness Day. I'm not sure if this is like a religious holiday or something that is new, but you know, I think that today is a lot of days of, you know, special feelings and special emotions, and especially that we have St. Patty's Day coming up on Wednesday. And so I'm glad to hear about some of the stories of that our Irish comrades are going to tell us today, and maybe give us some greater context, especially being that, you know, you and I, Danny, we both live in the Northeast. We both live in New York, and Irish people especially are such a great and important aspect to our culture here in the Northeast and in New York City. So just to see how that connects with, you know, the struggles in Ireland, how that connects with the struggles here in the U.S. and all over the world. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So we'll introduce, we have Paul Corboyd, Andrew Mac Rodri, and Kieran O'Brien, three comrades, leaders from Lasair Dhearg. We want to chop it up with them, welcome them to the ANTICONQUISTA family. It's late out there in West Belfast, so thanks for taking the time out to make this connection. Yeah, and let's jump into it. So yeah, set the stage. Maybe for those who don't know about the Irish liberation struggle, what's the first thing you all would want to share? 2021, where is this struggle at today?
I suppose the most important thing, or the thing that probably comes to mind for most people when they look at the Irish liberation struggle in the current context, the first thing that probably comes to mind is the Good Friday Agreement and what's often defined as the peace process. So you have this international, or this projection onto the international stage of, Ireland being at peace and the great questions of Irish freedom being resolved. Our organisation and our activists and most of the people around us would contend that that's actually not the case. That the core issues the core issues of the liberation struggle remain unresolved, and all that has happened with the peace process is what we would often refer to as a pacification process, where the end of the war in the late 90s allowed the British to open up new markets. It allowed the British to have new and cheap labour. It allowed the British to normalise what is an abnormal police force. And all of those types of things have been supported by what we would contend is a former revolutionary organisation. We live in an area which is quite tight-knit, so you only have to walk up the road on any given day and you'll be meeting members of Sinn Féin and other organisations. So it's like a small village. There's quite a huge division there amongst different organisations within a very small area. Another point to be made, if we're talking about the pacification process, is the opening up of new markets and stuff like that, is that the housing situation in this part of Ireland, and indeed in the south, since the end of the most recent conflict in the late 90s, the housing situation has gradually gotten worse and worse. And indeed, over the last few years, it's become an acute issue. So the peace process for us as young people, young leaders, as some would say, in our community, it's arguably created more difficulty. One striking figure that's been bandied about quite recently, with the deaths over the last 3 decades of the war was 3,500 people. More people have died since the end of the war of suicide alone in our part of the world. So, that peace process has swapped some deaths for others, but those other deaths, it's not defined as a war or anything like that. So, yeah, for us as young people, we don't see the peace process as it's viewed on the international stage as some new beginning,
Yeah, the generational trauma, the historical trauma, 800 years of colonialism, educational colonialism, military colonialism, economic colonialism, and how that impacts the Irish people generation to generation. So, Kayla, you can jump in, or the other two comrades.
Yeah, so I noticed you guys said that you're from Belfast, and so, much like what the United States had done to, let's say, Korea, or had tried to do to Vietnam by splitting what is one nation of people, splitting them into 2 different entities. I noticed that, Belfast is the capital of Northern Ireland. And I just want to know, is there a growing sentiment in what is Northern Ireland to rejoin in the 6 counties to rejoin the Republic of Ireland, or is it remaining as a status quo, or we're going to stay part of the UK? So if you could tell us a little bit more about that history and some of the sentiments that are going on within your people now, and where you look to go to in the future in regards of a possible reuniting.
Yeah, happy to come in there for the other 2 lads come in. More in recent decades, particularly since kind of the advent of Brexit, there's been renewed calls for a border poll and kind of increased attitude north and south for a united Ireland, and that is growing politically. That hasn't been measured. Sinn Féin would say that's measured in their electoral support that's rising in the south, while in the north it's diminishing and somewhat just sort of plateauing. But primarily since Brexit, the arguments for United Ireland have re-emerged, even within what they would be respectable political discourse within Parliament, within mainstream parties, the conversation around unity is happening again. Is unity the goal of what Republicans and we are seeking, and the arguments that these parties are putting forward are arguments? I don't think so. The arguments that they're bandying forward, particularly since Brexit, is what the primary reason now for reunification is: we'll leave Britain and we'll rejoin the EU by joining the South. And for us, leaving one occupation to join another occupation isn't rational, and it isn't productive for the objective that is a 32-county socialist republic. And we have those arguments coming forward just in terms of GDP and these kind of miracle economic growth arguments that don't really coalesce with socialist arguments and the arguments for secure housing, for secure education. It's all how better and how freer the market would be in a united Ireland than it would be under British occupation and partition.
Thanks a lot, Ciaran. And shout out to Funkadelic and Juan and Socialist, Swan, American Marksman, Jenny, everyone who joins us on the live. Share the live, have people tune in to build this international solidarity. A lot of people talking about the 8 centuries of an anti-colonial struggle. 26 plus 6 equals 1. Down with British colonialism. Hail, hail, the Celts are here. So lots of love coming from Los Angeles to New York. When I came back from East Belfast, Derry, it was at the height of Occupy Wall Street. And I came back with so much ancestral energy. I have roots back in Scotland, Ireland, England as well, working class roots. And when I came back, I was so excited to build with other Irish Americans. But, most of us, we never learned the true history. So I'm curious for you all, for those who don't understand, what's the difference between growing up in West Belfast on the Falls Road versus growing up in the 26 counties, in Dublin, in Galway? What are some of the big historical or cultural differences?
See, for our generation now, I am approaching 35 years old. The other comrades here that are with me from Lasair Dhearg wouldn't be far behind me. For our generation, myself in particular, I would remember the war, the end of the war, but most of our youth has been growing up in the shadow of it. So we've seen largely the political, the economic, and the social fallout of that war. We've spoken before there about the opening up of new markets post-conflict. So largely what we've experienced is reflective now of what similar aged individuals in the south of Ireland will be experiencing in terms of poverty, lack of access to adequate or cost-effective housing and so forth. So there are lots and lots of parallels which are drawn over a somewhat invisible border. You drive along one road, you're on the same road, and you're in a new state, supposedly. So besides currency, there are lots of parallels to be drawn. Again, all in the shadow for ourselves up here of the conflict and of the suicide and everything else that brings. For a large part, we've had arguably a normal, well, I suppose that word requires some perspective, but a somewhat normal society in comparison to others now after the conflict. But you're swapping certain deaths for others, when you talk about the deaths during the war and deaths from suicide and poverty thereafter. The most striking thing that comes to mind post-conflict here is the real lack of community. So I was speaking to a fellow there a few years ago about that particular issue. The war seemed to bring an awful lot of people together. Everybody had to work together, and you really had to look out for your neighbours now. And he said to me that, we used to have community, but what we have now is society. And there's a big difference,
Yeah, it's sort of, you said some of us in terms of age aren't long behind. I'm only 23. I forget what age Andrew is. So I was born in 1997. The Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998. So I would be turned in the ceasefire was 1994. So me and I think Andrew would be termed what they call ceasefire babies. So we grew up not knowing the war, and we were kind of again born into what they call peace and grew up in peace. Now again, the understanding of peace is very important in terms of, granted, we don't have British troops walking along the street. We don't have bombs going off as regularly. We don't have shootings as regularly. But to use the term peace, from in my childhood growing up, the violence that I've known is completely different to the violence that my mother and my father and other ancestors would have known, where they would have known murdering and assassination. I've known suicides, and I've known self-harm, and I've known drug abuse, and I've known all different cascades that now present these issues to young people, to the ceasefire babies who don't actually know peace. We know a lack of war, but we don't know peace. And that kind of brings in the conversations around intergenerational trauma. And as Paul says, around the kind of dissolution of community. And I guess that goes back to Thatcher's idea of there is no such thing as community or society. There's only the individual. So we have, a society and communities that were very closely knit, brought together in solidarity and struggle and oppression, that are now in the advent of neoliberalism, which seeks to divide us and put us in their individual cages. You have the trauma isn't being dealt with collectively, it's been dealt with individually. And that's why you see the rise in suicides, the rise in drug use, the rise in self-harm, and the massive rise in youth migration. That was one of the big things coming out of school. If you didn't go to university, you either left the country, or tragically, more likely, some of my friends, you just ended up dead. And not through, assassination through political enemies, but by their own hand, because of an economic system that had largely discarded them, and told us we knew peace and we should be grateful for what all the people on the Hill, the politicians on the Hill, the former revolutionaries, who promised us a lot, didn't really deliver on.
Yeah, I think even one of the things that Kieran had touched on there, like I was born in 1984. I think the Provisional Republican Movement had their ceasefire in April. I was born in May. And in terms of the working class, we're very divided because of the trauma that's been there for decades. But we were promised this peace, and any time that we would try to argue against constitutional nationalists, that we should be grateful, like Kieran said, for the peace and tranquility that we have now, as they would want to call it. But I mean, we are more divided than ever. British rule has been more cemented than ever. I mean, you have Belfast completely divided by peace walls. There is now more peace walls post-conflict than what there was before. So the segregation has been there through the decades, and it's gradually got worse. I mean, we have still Catholic schools in our areas, rather than Protestant schools in other areas. You wouldn't have integrated housing, integrated education. So we're very much segregated in terms of the working class, and that divide is very hard to overcome because of the decades of trauma that exists there. But capitalism allows that to continue to thrive, and it just worsens the situation.
I just want to ask real quick, and I have a question, but before, Andrew, could you give us a look at your shirt? So it looks like your name is covering the bottom part of it, but still hate Thatcher. That is awesome.
That's the greatest T-shirt ever. We need a few hundred. We still hate Reagan here.
Reagan's grave is a public bathroom. And so, I before the pandemic hit in the summer of 2019, I got the opportunity to go to Eastern and Central Europe. And while I was there, for some reason, there were a lot of Irish people. I mean, I made friends in Poland alone with like 10 Irish girls from Galloway. So, shout out to Galloway. But I would ask them questions and, in a friendly way about, what it's like in terms of the same conversations that we're having right now is how does the conflict exist, and, kind of gathering their opinions of, what had happened and what is called now the Troubles. Also, I spent a lot of time watching Derry Girls. Please don't judge me, but, at the end of the day, I'm still from America. Like, that show is awesome. But it appears like, especially maybe, I'm 23 years old as well. So people in our generation, 1997 and maybe even younger, they have a different idea of, and maybe this could be like a lot of propaganda from, you know, the colonizers and who remains in power. Still, at the end of the day, Ireland is still a bourgeois state. Northern Ireland is a bourgeois state. The UK is a bourgeois state. So they're still feeding these bourgeois ideas to our youth. And so it seemed as though a lot of, you know, the young girls that I met were looked a little bit negatively upon what had happened in the past. And so if you guys could just explain that a little bit more, how do you guys combat that? Is that something that you actually see reflected among your youth? And how is it that you guys work to reinvigorate the youth and get them back in the struggle for national liberation?
I suppose from going to university with a lot of and having friends across the country, if we separated from the occupied 6 counties and the 26 counties, and from the people who would be in Galway or wherever your friends were from that you met abroad from the 26 counties, in terms of like what they're taught in their own history schools, they aren't really, to my understanding, ever been taught about the troubles or the conflict here in the last 30 years. It's not on their curriculum. They might be so lucky to be taught about revolutionary Ireland and the founding of the 26 county state and the fight against the British there. But even then, that's drawn within the kind of parameters of nationalism, bourgeois nationalism, and not revolutionary socialism or national liberation. I think for the youth in the occupied 6 counties, they showed the video of International Women's Day there just before. All those paintings, all those murals are all within about a 5-10 minute walking distance of my house. I walk down the street every day to work and see revolutionary figures painted on the side of walls, and I see posters and slogans, and I see a revolutionary history around me that is very much, I think, absent from other towns across Ireland. One of the best things to do in Ireland to learn history is you go to the museums and the memorials, and they are scattered across Ireland, and it's a great way to learn the history. But I think in the streets of Derry, the streets of Belfast, are littered. There's an abundance. Granted, there's less nowadays, with people wanting to paint again these peace murals and putting around. It's commercializing the murals, taking it away from its revolutionary history. But I can still walk to work, and I'm surrounded by revolutionary women, revolutionary people, and we can be inspired by that, which I think the youth of the 26 counties are often robbed of, because they often refer to those who took power in the 26 counties after the revolution, and who took power basically from the counter-revolution, as the most conservative revolutionaries of the 20th century. And from that kind of period, they would have stripped away the revolutionary lineage in the communities of Galway and Cork, of anywhere across Ireland, that didn't actually fit, again, the bourgeois nationalist interpretation of history that's seen them victorious. Anything to do with, what they would be the Civil War, in terms of the fight from the IRA against people who were willing to accept the treaty. The people like Mellows and other ones, were their history, their kind of revolutionary presence on the walls of places in Wexford and Cork would have been stripped away to a large extent. Whereas again, here, it's very much celebrated more. So I think that's the big kind of distinction between the youth north and south that kind of embrace that kind of revolutionary history and what they might think happened here. And it's very interesting that when they do come here to study, I studied politics and history, and the conversations that we had, and the thing was with them is conversations that I would have had 5 or 6, 7 years ago in previous lower education, but they're having it for the first time in universal education.
That's deep. Growing up in the North versus the South, it's almost a different national experience and a different national history, at least for the past however many centuries or decades. I think it's important for us to share some of the images of these revolutionary murals, which still stand for people who haven't been in Derry and Belfast. Here we have, this is a mural dedicated to the Irish language, which was a big piece of British colonialism, stamping out the language and the last names and trying to anglicize those last names. Here we have
the mural there, top left-hand side, is of IRA volunteer Bobby Sands, and it's timely to talk about Bobby as well because he died on hunger strike on the 5th of May 1981, and his anniversary occurs, his 40th anniversary occurs this year, so we'll be commemorating Bobby and his 9 comrades.
Nice. I'll read the quote from Bobby Sands, and everyone should study Bobby Sands' writing in poetry. An incredible example of a self-sacrificing revolutionary who gave everything to the struggle of Irish republicanism, of Irish unity, of a socialist Ireland. And here are 2 of his most beautiful, poignant quotes. Everyone, Republican or otherwise, has their own particular role to play. And our revenge will be the laughter of our children. Some of his most poetic words. And that was one of my main impressions from the time that I spent in the 6 counties. When you were on the Irish side, the Catholic side, the nationalist side, Republican side, it was the history, the struggle was coming out of love. And there were flags of Palestine everywhere. There were connections to Nicaragua, to indigenous people struggling here in the U.S., in occupied Turtle Island, to the Basque Country, to South Africa, to the anti-apartheid struggle. You felt this incredible sense of internationalism. And then when I crossed over to the loyalist areas, I would see Israeli flags, Zionist flags, British flags, of course, the Union Jack, and it was the polar opposite sentiment. It's Margaret Thatcher versus Bobby Sands. Which side do you stand on? So yeah, tell us, what does Bobby Sands mean to the youth of today? Are there still? Tell us about the memorials, the commemorations. When I was there was different plays and theater, poetry readings. So tell us about that everyday culture of resistance.
I think it's fair to say that Bobby and his 9 comrades have been, rightly celebrated, justly celebrated, and they've almost been dehumanized due to their, the position that they've taken up in the Irish freedom struggle. Sometimes it's often difficult to understand, even for me, whenever I was learning about Irish history, it's difficult to comprehend that Bobby was just a young Irish working class boy from a working class estate within just a few short miles of where we all live, and he was such an intelligent individual. You have to understand, and it's very interesting to think that Bobby, having spent so many years in prison with his other comrades, with next to nothing to read or to write on, he was able to write poetry and keep a diary and things like that. It was a very, very intelligent individual. Ourselves will be commemorating Bobby. There were 7 IRA volunteers and 3 INLA volunteers that died in the 1981 hunger strike. We ourselves are involved in a local committee here called Stalk 81. Stalk 81 comes from the Gaelic Stalk Ogras, which is hunger strike. So Strike 81, we're involved in that committee, and we're putting together plans locally in West Belfast here to commemorate the 10 hunger strikers of 81 over the course of this year. There'll be a mural unveiled in the west of the city in Lenadoon, and close to where IRA hunger striker Joe McDonnell lived. A lot of our comrades that we're working with on that committee were in jail. They are political ex-prisoners. They were in jail with the hunger strike as well. So for us as young people, as much as we can feel detached from the likes of Bobby and that because of their elevated position within the struggle, it's, over time you slowly realize that they were just people like us, similarly aged to us when they were involved in the struggle. So over the course of this year, we'll be remembering them in a very fitting way.
I think what really interests a lot of people on our side of the pond, particularly Latin American people, African people, colonized people, about the Irish liberation struggle is that you have a country, you have a nation, the Irish nation, where, it's in Western Europe. You are, to us, considered white, but yet we have so much connection, so much international solidarity. Thatcher was someone that was an oppressor to your nation. Thatcher is someone who was an enemy to your nation. And she was also an enemy to the Latin American peoples. She was, helped and aided in the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile and the installation of the dictator Augusto Pinochet, who slaughtered Chilean people. Spreading neoliberalism and supporting death squads all over Latin America, as well as in Scotland and in Ireland. And it's been really inspirational, I think, from people from our side of the pond that have become very interested in the Irish liberation struggle to support that. But it's also very interesting because in the United States, where there are a lot of Irish immigrants, there is always through history, there's become a conflict between, let's say, Black and brown people and the Irish people. And I guess the Irish Americans that come from, the Irish Americans that have assimilated. And I guess if you guys could talk a little bit about, one, the international solidarity that the Irish nation has always exemplified and has with other colonized people in the world, and talk about what is the Irish position of Irish Americans who engage in racism, who betray the working class interests.
I'm going to let you come in there, Andrea, if you wanted to say something.
I was just going to mention something beforehand. Sorry to go off topic. Okay, I was just on Bobby Sands, and Bobby Sands has been widely recognised and his 9 comrades throughout the world as a figure of resistance. But where we live in West Belfast, and certainly in Ireland, you would have former revolutionaries in power now within the take part within the British state that would use the images of Bobby Sands to further solidify their political campaign in terms of constitutionalist nationalism. And they would always be very internationalist in their approach in terms of identifying and having solidarity with political prisoners, whether it be in the Basque Country, whether it be in Palestine and elsewhere in the world, but they would be very ignorant towards Republican prisoners that are now imprisoned within British and Free State jails in Ireland. And you can see that division there between republicanism and how they've deepened that division by not recognising Republican prisoners and being part and parcel of the state that actually incarcerates those prisoners within those jails.
I would agree with that sentiment as well. And Kyla, to go back to your question there, I think the Irish freedom struggle has always drawn an affinity with other struggles throughout the world, going back for generations. During various campaigns in the early late 1800s, with the formation of the European republics and France and stuff like that, there was a great affinity then, obviously, given the context of their time. In the most recent conflict, IRA and INLA prisoners in the jails during the hunger strike would have drawn huge affinity with the struggle in Palestine, or with the ANC in South Africa and other struggles, Algeria, Cuba. We've always watched with admiration and hope internationally. And, as socialists ourselves, we understand that the struggle is indeed an internationalist one when you consider the internationalist objectives of imperialism. So that's actually formed some of our campaigns locally here in Belfast as well, where we've gone out of our way to highlight that at a local level, where imperialism doesn't just stop at the state. There are local businesses here in Belfast and beyond across Ireland that are complicit in occupations, are complicit in war, are complicit in death by the making of weapons of war and the supply of weapons of war to Saudi Arabia, or, for use in Yemen. And we also have big hearts here in Ireland for the Palestinian struggle. as well. The talk of murals, which litter our road here on the Falls Road where we live, feature Frederick Douglass, feature Leila Khalid, Angela Davis, Che Guevara, and the list goes on. So there's a huge affinity here for other struggles, and we understand that imperialism doesn't stop no matter what color your skin is or your religion. It's all about the money. We abhor racism. We stamp it out. We've been actively involved here in Ireland of building the anti-fascist struggle as well with other organisations. We've been on the ground in Belfast chasing racists off the street. I'm very, very proud to say. In regards to the Irish American community, we're acutely aware of support from those who draw affinity with us, having support for the likes of Trump and others. And to say that it disappoints us would be a huge understatement. I think it would be fair for us to say that we draw no comparisons with our Irishness, with the supposed Irishness of any individual in America or elsewhere that seeks to exclude others based on the colour of their skin or anything else.
And there's a lot of comments here on the YouTube live in solidarity with this internationalism. A lot of shout outs to the San Patricios in Mexico, which maybe you all can comment upon. A great quote here from James, who shares that the Scottish ruling class, according to Tom Devine, the Scottish ruling class, their main export to the world has been men of violence. Shout out to Michelin and Lex, American Marksman, a lot of good historical comments and solidarity with the Irish liberation struggle. Let's show Lasair Dhearg's Twitter so people can follow you all and stay in touch on Twitter. Forgive me for continually butchering the Gaelic language, the Irish language. I know y'all over there laughing at me mispronouncing it, but one day at a time. We did have Irish language classes here on Tuesdays for years at Rocky Sullivan's Irish Republican bar in Red Hook, Brooklyn, but I clearly did not make enough Tuesdays. A big struggle that the comrades can tell us more about is the PSNI and what the police continue to represent an occupying force in the Irish community, in the arrogance with which they strut through the Catholic nationalist neighborhoods. Some similarities to the NYPD and the LAPD and every occupying force. And I think it's important to show, well, here you all have the Twitter, so you can follow the comrades on Twitter and their work. And the George Floyd mural that went up in West Belfast because of this historical struggle against police brutality. So drawing all of these connections. But talk to us about the relationship of the youth in the police. How does it play out every day in Derry, in Belfast?
Go ahead, Chip.
No, I was waiting for you to come on that one. So I guess like the interpretation of the PSNI can be taken on, just certainly in a Marxist sense, just like any other police force that is there as the arm wing of the state, a tool of the state to enforce the rights of property and the protection of the property of the haves and the people of property. And then there's the additional side of the PSNI that isn't normal, that isn't peculiar, that we're constantly trying to highlight. That is not only do these people serve the interests of the rich, but they also serve a political ideology, and that is the ideology of unionism, of pro-British colonialism, not just on how they operate today, but their history is steeped in protection and the enforcement of colonialism across Ireland, both economic, cultural, and just militarily. So the PSNI today, in terms of what was formerly the RUC, what we've had with the police force, for me growing up and being conscious, I think it was 2009, it was a bit reformed, and we used to say the name reformed, and it was actually just redesigned. We did a very interesting documentary recently, 8 minutes long, that documented the unchanged nature of the PSNI in terms of, okay, they may put a shamrock on their uniforms, they may have changed the colour of their jeeps to make them look more pleasant, but the sectarian makeup in terms of the individual officers, their religious background, where they've came from, where they've received their training, majority of them are still former serving officers, or agents or soldiers or whatever you want to look at them, from the previous police force that was supposed needed to be reformed, that remains intact today. So we have a police force that is, again, like any other capitalist police force, but it's it's abnormal in the sense that it is wholly directed by British intelligence, using special branch, and that it is guided very clearly by a pro-colonial ideology.
One of the core Republican demands during the conflict was that the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, be disbanded. They were the frontline force of the occupation. There was a clear and very public British strategy to normalise the force, to make, to put the RUC front and centre ahead of the British Army during the conflict, so as the conflict could be glossed over or presented as an internal conflict between Protestants and Catholics, when it was anything but the case. In fact, there were Protestant members of the IRA, the NLA, and other organisations. So if it was anything but a religious war, it was a very deeply political one. And so the British state sought to put the RUC front and centre, as some sort of civil enforcement of law and order, when in reality they were all about solidifying the occupation. So that core Republican demand during the conflict that the RUC be disbanded was obviously subject to much conversation during the Good Friday Agreement. What actually came of that was, in the early 2000s, the RUC was simply rebranded. Some legislation was put forward and they changed the name of the force overnight. The heavily militarised barracks that they exist in throughout the 6 counties, their heavily militarised anti-ballistic armoured vehicles, their weaponry, everything else was carried over into this new force, including the personnel. Now, there's much argument made in more recent times about the religious makeup of the PSNI in order to present the force as somewhat reflective of the society that it purports to represent. Less than 30% of the force are Catholic, not that that means anything to us. And one of the most hated parts of that police force, which was formerly known as Special Branch, much hated in our communities because they were complicit in much of the state collusion, state-sponsored unionist loyalist death squads, etc. That organisation, or that part of the PSNI, was rebranded as well, and it's now currently known as C3 Intelligence Branch, and it's been cut up to include C3 and the Tactical Support Group, which are basically foot soldiers of the Crown on the streets of where we live. And those organisations collectively, as part of the PSNI, have over the past decade used or forced people to be stopped and searched more than 370,000 times. And this is for, the 6 counties is a state with a small population. There are cities in England and in America which have a much bigger population size than this supposed state. So the PSNI for us, that the rebranded Special Branch, the much hated Special Branch, just to give an indication, 73% of their personnel are former RUC personnel, of which 92% of them come from what's termed the Protestant community. So as an organisation, it is not reflective of the Irish working class. It is reflective of the intentions of the occupation and the state. And the actions of that organisation can be seen day and daily. They are, at the minute, on a huge PR drive. If anybody follows their social media, West Belfast PSNI, for example, you will see day and daily that they're presenting the forces, on the road, on the beat, on their bicycles in our community, policing the streets and being on hand to help you get your cat out of a tree. A friend of ours that we know was walking through a park, seen these very friendly PSNI officers, and they stopped and searched them for no reason. There's video on social media of the aggressive nature of the individuals. So for us as a community, seeing these PR tactics being rolled out, it's actually quite laughable, because you're seeing policemen and policewomen on bicycles driving down your street that you've never seen them do that before, and you see it appearing on social media. So for us looking at it, it's a wee bit embarrassing to see that this is the tactics that they're employing to make themselves look normal when they're anything but that.
Yeah, the PR war on the PSNI side is in overdrive at the moment, was very much in recent weeks. And this is one of the great advents of social media in a way, where things happen now and that they will always go documented as the PSNI were seen escorting the UVF, which is an armed loyalist gang, around the streets of East Belfast, giving them an escort whilst they roamed the streets. Then, I think it was only a week later, the PSNI were captured, arresting one of the survivors of the Sean Graham Bookies massacre at the anniversary where they were commemorating. They came and arrested, I think it was the only survivor there at the memorial for breach of COVID guidance, which is interesting considering that the only arrest ever made around the Sean Graham Bookies massacre was the arrest they made only a couple of weeks ago, and it was one of the survivors. And there's been collusion proven in that case. Paul can attest to that, and to the story of the Sean Graham Bookies massacre himself came from the Armo.
Yeah, I lived on the road where the Sean Graham Bookies atrocity occurred. I was obviously a child at the time. I was actually on the footpath outside when two loyalist gunmen burst into the bookmaker's shop and just opened fire with automatic weapons and handguns on those inside. 5 people died inside, while I think it was 15 were injured. The individual, Mark Sykes, was one of the survivors. And like Kieran says, he was arrested at a memorial there recently, where just a week previous they had escorted, the PSNI had escorted a loyalist paramilitary organisation through the town. And it's just a hark back as well to the comparisons there when we talk about, it's not just in an Irish context when we're talking about policing. I'm sure you guys have your own stories to tell with, obviously, George Floyd will be a recently quite highlighted case. At the moment, there's a scenario rolling out there, a scenario being played out in England in a place called Clapham Common, where 30 days ago a woman called Sarah Everard disappeared, and just recently a serving police officer has been arrested and formally charged with her murder. There has been a bit of movement on the ground in Clapham Common, where hundreds of women and their allies turned out to as part of a vigil and to reclaim the streets, where our sisters, our mothers, our cousins, etc., shouldn't be afraid to walk the streets at night. So this huge vigil turned out, and over the course of a few hours, many numbers of London police gathered and basically dragged them off the street. So we're seeing images of women protesting as their right, as part of a vigil to reclaim the streets, and they're literally being dragged off the streets by armed, mostly men. So some quite striking images. And tonight, I understand even more women and their allies have gathered. Now, there are arguments around COVID and stuff, but I would just like to send a big message of solidarity to those women that are gathering at present.
I learned about that case earlier today, and it just speaks volumes that, yes, it's Women's Month. It was just International Working Women's Day, and you have police officers, yes, in there and in your nation, in our nation, that continue to act on behalf of capital, continue to act on behalf of the ruling class. And when the workers rise up and, demand justice, they get attacked. And this goes to show that as long as there's, a bourgeois ruling class in power anywhere in the world, the people will always be disadvantaged. The police will never represent their interests. I have a question, and this is an interesting take that I heard. Paul, you said this earlier. It was you, Kieran. You said that in Northern Ireland there was talk because of Brexit to reunite with the Republic of Ireland to be reintegrated into the EU, and you said that it was trading up one occupation for another occupation. And over here on our side of the pond, we've never really heard this argument in support against the EU, in support of Brexit, and that it was actually a positive thing for the UK, or it would be a positive thing for Ireland. If you could tell us a little bit about how is the EU a force of occupation for your nation?
So the primary for the EU, both north and south, primarily down south, as well as the kind of political imperialism, which really transcends the economic imperialism. So what you have with the EU is, if you hark back to the 2007 financial crisis and collapse of capitalism there, and the EU diktats that were handed down from the European Commission, the nations like Ireland, to Portugal and Greece, these diktats of, here's your economic plan, we're going to give you this money, here's all the conditions that come along with it. And that was, of course, austerity, privatization, the sell-off of public resources into private hands. That was, down south, was absolutely brutal, and it came as quite a hard fall to a lot of people, because for, I think, almost a decade beforehand, they had a period of economic growth that was referred to quite romantically as the Celtic Tiger. So this idea of where people had a lot of money, and again, it's your kind of classical boom and bust capitalism, which it was even more rampant today. And this kind of facilitation of economic growth and the modernisation of Ireland into the European economy that allowed the enrichment of a particular section of the middle class and, of course, the upper class. And once this financial crisis hit, the working class felt it, and those who felt the kind of the small ticklings of capitalism's wealth for the few, and they fell back in. We kind of understood then the gist of what the EU was really about. They wanted access to a new Irish market that had new industries, new potential for profit. We see that with the housing. We see it massively within our fisheries. Ireland has one of the greatest oceans and surrounding fisheries in the world. But what nations own the boats that are fishing in our seas? It's not Ireland. It's the Dutch, it's the German super trawlers that are coming into our oceans and raping the seas of everything. And small independent Irish farmers can't compete with that. They can't, and there's these are small fishing villages, families, independent businesses, trying to compete with multinational companies and their super trawlers. So the primary occupation of down south from the EU is an economic occupation that is robbing us of our national resources and our ability to decide our own destinies, both politically and economically.
I think as well, just to add on to that, one of the most standout scenarios that highlights the imperialism of the EU is the situation with Greece, with the rise of Syriza many years ago, and how that played out. There are huge comparisons to be drawn between the European Central Bank and the IMF, which act often hand in glove with the economic outcomes that they demand from nation states within the EU.
A lot of great recommendations here in the chat on different books. I'm going to have to stay up all night tonight because some of these books, Nothing But an Unfinished Song, The Lost Revolution, these are classics. 10 Men Dead. This was stuff my mother had me reading from a young age when she was raising me on this history. I'll read from here by a journalist, David Beresford. He has a great passage here that no matter what Thatcher and the British did, how strong the hunger strikers were. So firsthand testimony, I was surprised that the morale of the prisoners was high. From talking to them, it is evident that they intend to continue their protest indefinitely, and it seems they prefer to face death rather than submit to being classed as criminals. Anyone with the least knowledge of Irish history knows how deeply rooted this attitude is in our country's past. In isolation and perpetual boredom, they maintain their sanity by studying Irish. It was an indication of the triumph of the human spirit over adverse material surroundings to notice Irish words, phrases, and songs being shouted from cell to cell and then written on each cell wall with the remnants of toothpaste tubes. So to see Longkesh, the prisons is the university of freedom, and it's really in Longkesh, it's in prison system that these hunger strikers and the IRA lockdown resurrect this interest in the Irish language. So inspiring, reminding me of the quote by Ho Chi Minh that a people can never be defeated when they're striving for independence. No amount of sophisticated modern bombs could ever defeat the Vietnamese or the Irish people. Another great book, Voices from the Grave. Certainly Brendan Hughes, The Dark, another uncompromising warrior who deserves to be studied. Other documentaries, resources, books, articles, websites, comrades, that you want to recommend to the audience for those who are newer to the Irish liberation struggle?
There is one book that I'm reading at the minute that a good comrade who's on the screen had bought me. It's called On Another Man's Wound by Ernie O'Malley. It focuses primarily on what we would call the Tan War, or what others might know as the War of Independence, which is the 1910s, 1920s, which saw the establishment of the 26 county Free State in the south of Ireland. It gives a great historical context to the time and the experiences of Ernie and his comrades as they sought to build the IRA and build the liberation struggle and push the British out of Ireland. Unfortunately, the counter-revolutionaries eventually won with Michael Collins and stuff. But as a book, the way it captures the period and how it humanizes people that were fighting the war, I would highly recommend it. Bit difficult to get your hands on it, but it's a great book. In terms of resources, ourselves, Lasair Dhearg, our Facebook page, we have a closed Facebook group called Friends of Lasair Dhearg. If you type Lasair Dhearg into Facebook, I'm sure it'll come up. We have lots of downloadable PDFs of significant and notable books that we would certainly recommend. Lots of as well in the US context with the Black Panthers and more. So it's definitely worth a look in. I'm not too sure if the other comrades here would recommend anything else.
Yeah, I suppose obviously we're forgetting about our own publication that we worked on, Paul. It was a project set up by Republicans. It was an independently managed project. It was a newspaper called Anspreek. It was kind of taken after, I think it was Lenin's first newspaper he wrote for was Iskra the Spark. So we followed that kind of inspiration, and it contains. It's only been written in the past 2 years maybe, and it contains a vast wave of Republican politics across the political spectrum from various organizations. Those are all available online. There's some you can still buy physical copies, but there's digital copies free online. Suppose one book, just because Paul mentioned that he's reading right now, one book that always comes to me that I recommend to people who want to learn about the revolutionary struggle in Ireland, particularly in the last 30 years, is a book by a man called Tommy McKerney. And it's a very great Marxist analytical book on the past 30 years of struggle within Ireland.
A book that I'm reading at the minute, and I tend to read this every year around the time of the hunger strike, is No Weekly Serve My Time, the H block struggle, and it focuses around 76 to 81. And Danny, just to ask yourself a question, I mean, you mentioned that you had to call Long Case the University of Freedom, where you've seen where prisoners were looking at struggles all around the world, and the internationalism that came out of that. Can you tell us a little bit, and for us that are listening and watching back home, about what's going on at the minute in Haiti?
What's going on right now in Haiti?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a whole nother episode, Andrew.
Yeah.
Even if you were just to summarize it.
Well, what we can do, we should set something up for our family back home. In Ireland, in Kayla, and right now, Jameer and other comrades are Ramiro. They're in Nicaragua. So some of the ANTICONQUISTA, the editors, the comrades, they just arrived in Nicaragua. We wish them safe travels. Of course, the United States has a vicious blockade against the Nicaraguan people. I taught in Nicaragua in 2005, and the Sandinistas reminded me so much of the IRA, the internationalism, but also the trauma of war. When you've been through war, I mean, I have my own PTSD, but nothing that compares to what Sandinistas and the IRA went through. How do you sleep at night? The insomnia, the need to, how do you sleep without drinking? And 5 drinks becomes, 10 ciders real quick. And so much of what I learned about in Nicaragua took me back to Belfast and in Derry. And the Haitian comrades right now are under attack. They're anti-imperialists. They're internationalists. One thing I can share from Haiti, once it was starting to get dark, they whisked away the top leadership, the ideological leaders, the national leaders, because the police and the gangs that are paramilitaries that work closely with the police, they were going to look for any excuse to take out the top leadership of Molegaf and PAPDA and the revolutionary organizations in Haiti. So it was only really, it was never safe. I mean, there were bullets and tear gas before it was 5 p.m. and it got dark. But that's just when it became even more dangerous. So all power to the Haitian people and their leadership. And you had to be on the front line, shoulder to shoulder in Haiti. I got back about, 10 days ago. But we could certainly do something so that we can make all these international connections. For me, it was an honor to be hosted by the Haitian Life and to amplify that struggle, because just as of 24 hours ago, it started trending. Free Haiti, and Cardi B got involved in the Shade Room, and shoot, with it, any national liberation struggle will take any help they can get, any solidarity. But CBS and NBC and CNN, if this was, in the words of one Haitian leader, I was in the streets with the tear gas anywhere, and I was trying to document it, and we're on the run. And very calmly, a Haitian leader came by and he said, "No one cares. This is not Hong Kong. No one cares. This is not Tibet or Taiwan." And he was like, "Welcome to Haiti." Blanc. Blanc means white boy. And he said it so calm. He didn't even miss a step. So every time I'm in Haiti, it's so educational. So if there's anything, in Ireland, we want to return the favor of solidarity and internationalism. And that's what this is. This is the war of ideas. This is the battle of ideas, as Fidel Castro laid out. That's why we named this show Daughters of Fidel, Sons of Fidel, Los Hijos de Fidel, after Fidel Castro, because like Bobby and the Dark, Brendan Hughes, and so many other of the ancestors and leaders, he was uncompromising. And that's why imperialism had unrelenting, unwavering hatred for Fidel. You can't find one positive word for Fidel in the imperialist press from the past 6 decades, because they couldn't bribe him, they couldn't kill him, they couldn't buy him. And that's the spirit of Irish republicanism. So yeah, it'd be beautiful to set something up, some type of report back with the comrades returning from Nicaragua, to give a voice to the Haitian comrades. And as we close up, Kayla, I had one more question, but Kayla, I'll give you the last question if you want. We don't want to. It's already 11:05 over in Belfast, so we don't want to abuse the comrades' time.
No, I don't have any more questions. You could take it away, Danny, but I just want to close up and say thank you so much for giving us this information. I mean, hopefully your last question includes something about St. Patrick's Day, especially that's coming up here. What we usually do in the United States is, well, really the Northeast, I don't think it's really celebrated anywhere else, is it's a huge parade. I mean, if it wasn't COVID, it would be a huge parade where people would be out in the streets drinking and all that stuff. And so if your question doesn't include that, just tell us how is St. Patrick's Day, if at all, celebrated on your part of the pond?
I think it would be fair to say that even as an organization, we don't celebrate St. Patrick's Day in the sense that it's celebrated in the US or in other places. For us, bit of a carnival atmosphere, you know, in Belfast in particular. The state tries to ban the Irish tricolour on the day. You can't actually have it at parades and stuff. Very unusual setup, you know, where St. Patrick's Day doesn't belong to the Irish people. But for us, it's more of a carnival atmosphere for kids and stuff. But as it's represented across the world outside of Ireland, there is almost a celebration of a nation. I think it's fair to say that as revolutionaries, the date that we would be commemorating and celebrating our nation would be to mark the 1916 Rising at Easter every year, where we rededicate ourselves to the Irish freedom struggle. So for us, that real nationalism comes out on that date as opposed to St. Patrick's Day. But I dare say, I'm a teetotal. I don't drink, just no interest in it. But a few of the comrades here on screen, I think on St. Patrick's Day, they might be imbibing a few Guinnesses and homemade alcohol, I believe.
I think it's like Brendan Behan says. He says, "I'm a drinker with a writing problem. I'm not a writer with a drinking problem." That's me. But I know there was probably a few raised eyebrows there as Paul mentioned about the tricolour being banned on St. Patrick's Day and official parades, and it's seen as a sectarian symbol. But again, that gives you a clear insight into the state and how it wants to embrace Republicans and how images or emblems of our ideology, of our revolutionary lineage are seen as controversial and therefore shouldn't be in public spaces. What's probably more eyebrow raising is in the recent decade, one of the biggest kind of issues of political turmoil was around loyalist flag protests, whereby as a kind of act of reconciliation, Unionists were only allowed to fly the Union flag from City Hall on a certain amount of days, and there was big upheaval about this. But you'll probably find it interesting to know that one of the days that they're allowed to fly the Union flag over our city is on St. Patrick's Day.
Wow, there's so much there. And here, St. Patrick's Day in New York City, where I live on the border of the Bronx and Yonkers, McLean Road, Woodlawn's probably the largest Irish and Irish American community here in the United States. I mean, McLean Road is all Irish in Yonkers and Woodlawn. On Wednesday, I'm not sure with COVID, this year it's curtailed, but every year there's this parade, but it's led by the NYPD, and people are getting smashed, as you all mentioned. Any revolutionary nationalist essence here on this side of the pond is not there. But you'll see like banners dedicated to the San Patricio Brigade, which we've mentioned. People should look up the San Patricios, Irish and Irish Americans who turned their guns back on the U.S. invading Armenia when U.S. invading Armenia when one-fourth of Mexico was stolen in the 1848 War of Aggression against the Mexican people. They call it the Mexican-American War, but when one side is the aggressor, like the genocidal war against the Korean people or the Vietnamese people, we have to take back that terminology and think of language liberation. This was a U.S. invasion, occupation, and theft of indigenous and Mexican land in Atzalan. So, comrades, thank you so much. This was educational. This is just the beginning. We want to continue to form this relationship. Everybody follow the comrades on Twitter, the Lasair Dhearg Red Flame of Ireland website. And thanks for taking this time. And to close out, every week we say, leales siempre, traidores nunca, venceremos. Always faithful to the struggle, never surrender. We shall overcome. Thanks a lot, comrades.
Thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
¡Viva el socialismo! ¡Patria muerte! ¡Venceremos!
You're listening to Sons of Fidel on ANTICONQUISTA with Victor Coronado and Danny Shaw. Sons of Fidel is a platform for the voiceless and marginalized, oppressed and colonized peoples, the working class, Black and brown radicals, the LGBTQ community, and our allies in the struggle against imperialism. Please note, the views expressed by the hosts or guests of Sons of Fidel may not necessarily reflect the views of ANTICONQUISTA.